How could I start? My experience with presentations is people like stories, so I'm more of a storyteller than a real presenter. And I also like to talk about the things I know, and I like to talk about the things I do rather than too much of theory. So much of what I will be presenting is really telling you the things I've been doing in my library in the past 3 years, which is the time when I took office at the Natural History Museum, following a very digital profiled career. Katia resumed my career as a librarian. I've been taking a very different step in the past 3 years because during the years I was working at the National Library of France. As you heard, I was more of a digital expert. So what's happening now with myself in that particular library in the museum, I hope is not only the result of me aging, like an aging librarian would have spent a lot of time working on the digital material or non-material, who all of a sudden realize that he's getting old and wants to touch base to earth in some way. But I actually think or observe that what I feel personally might be reflective of something that's happening more generally in the world and with the people. And that's a signal I heard after all those years of working with data. And I felt, okay, enough with data. I do work still with data in many ways, but my focus has shifted from digital innovation to, well, post-digital reinvention of what a library could be. So, because it's storytelling based on a use case, which is particular, which is a natural history museum library, which is a very specific kind of library. It's a special library, it's a research library. My stories not necessarily will translate into your various environments. So none of that is a recipe. I'm not going to show you the way to nothing. What I would like to share with you, and that could be my core message, and you would leave the room right now, you'll just only bring that back, is it's about changing, and I will use a French word, it's more about un état d'esprit, a way of looking at your audience, but also a way at looking at what I will call your resources. I think we librarians are really bad at selling ourselves. We're not really bad at marketing ourselves. And we have resources that we think are boring to the public or to anybody else than ourselves. And those resources might actually be our collections as such, especially the stuff in the back, or the techniques we use to manage those collections, or it can also be the skills, the specific skills that we have developed in our teams. And I think that one thing you could bring back is that whatever you're hiding from the public might be what the public is most interested in today. So you will see bears in most of my slides because that's my new animal. At the Natural History Museum, it's very common to have we're all looking at taxons, particular species, so any researcher or even any librarian has a particular animal or flower that is representing them. I'm the bear. So the library where I work for, maybe I give you a little bit of context. The Natural History Museum in Paris is actually an institution that consists of a botanical garden, several galleries that form a museum. Most of you who have been visiting this place in Paris must have heard or visited what we call the Great Gallery of Evolution, which used to be the zoological gallery. But we also have botany, mineralogy, and the sort of galleries you would expect in such a museum. But what people don't necessarily know is that the institution also consists of a great zoo, the zoo in Vincennes, slightly outside of Paris, which was renovated a couple of years ago. And also with the Museum of Man and Women, le Musée de l'Homme, in the Trocadero section, which is more the anthropology and ethnology part of our activity. So the three main sites make the Muséum d'Histoire Naturelle, and we also have a couple of sites outside of Paris. This is why we are a national museum. The library in that context is actually more than one library. There is one central library which is located in the botanical garden, completely hidden between the greenhouses and the main gallery. We are in a corner. Furthermore, a couple of years ago, actually in the 90s, when the Great Gallery of Evolution was remodeled by a famous architect, Shemetov, still alive and actually watching carefully about his architecture like most architects do, he found the library that was the most recent building built on the garden, that is in the 60s, 1963 precisely, to be a really ugly building, all made of concrete and steel. Even though it was very modern when it was built, it was sort of an insult to the architecture of the rest. So Shemetov made sure to cover completely the library with something really dark so that nobody would see the building. So even though the garden is always packed with people and families and naturalists who go to the garden, and when you go there, it's always plenty of people, the library is empty. So when I came into office, I was kind of, my first vision was the vision of empty reading rooms, which might be to some of you a familiar vision. And we are supposed to serve two sorts of public, like the whole museum. We have two missions. One is clearly research. So our core activity is to serve the researchers from the museum and any researchers in the field of natural history and natural science. And we also have a mission for a greater public, which is dissemination of natural sciences to the greater public, the families, the kids. And we have actually two floors in that building. The main floor is for the greater public, and it looks like a school library, if you want, because it's really from the 90s. And the research library that you can see here with the empty seats, which is designed for research and where communication of books from the stacks can be organized. I should say regarding the collection that we have about 3 million books, and we're one of the three. You know, you're supposed to always be the first or the second and the three worldwide. So we're supposed to be one of the three world natural history special library, together with the Smithsonian in Washington and together with the Natural History Museum in London. But it really is a big library, and also the content is really interesting because, and I think that is a bit similar to your library. It's really a combination of heritage stuff, really recent, contemporary, and digital stuff, together with things that look like more like what we find in a museum. We have actually quite a lot of objects, and we also have the responsibility for the archives of the institutions. So it's a pretty much of an organic ensemble, which make it very challenging and interesting to catalog, and of course not 10% of that is cataloged, but also a very complex, interesting ensemble of things that could be turned into different ways depending on the sort of public you want to reach. So the library was empty, even though it was in the middle of a very crowded place. So why? Those are very, very standard observations that you could make in any of your libraries, especially in a research library and especially in the science area. Natural science, like in physics or in other disciplines, even stronger or faster than in the humanities, everything went electronic and digital. And we were part of that process, we had to. So there was historical, now it's history because it's been in the past 20 years, redeployment of resources from buying physical books and spending our budget on monography or periodicals in print to buying electronic resources, which involve less choice actually. Because you know the way it works, we buy huge groups of resources to the same over-concentrating publishers. So to the end of the day, you make a few bills and that's your acquisition policy. And on the top of that, we did start digitizing our collection as part of a consortium of natural history libraries called BHL. So BHL in French is the name of a very bad philosopher. So here it stands for Biodiversity Heritage Library. This is a consortium run by the Smithsonian in Washington, and we're part of that project. So whatever we digitize only, we avoid duplicates, so we digitize stuff that hasn't been already digitized by others. So that forms actually a digital library for our core audience. So our researchers at the museum, we used to be historically, and the archives bring testimonies of that, extremely active users of the library, just stopped coming because they could find everything on their desk. So we spend a lot of money for them to access the databases. They don't even know it's the library that's paying for it, because we also try to maintain a very sophisticated ILS system that they don't use. They don't use it because they go to the place they like, and there's no way to force a researcher. And also, as you know, researchers are always a specialist of something. So the librarian is trying to make a global solution for all sorts of research in scope. But if you're specifically interested in botany, you don't want to have to do anything to do with people with zoology or mineralogy. And even between and among the botanists, they hate each other. So they won't like to use the same database. And so they will always use their stuff and prefer commercial or community-based and research-based solutions to any system that will provide a generic global approach to information search. So we spend a lot of money on buying content or buying access to content and developing interfaces that they don't use. So not only the reading rooms are empty, and even though the statistics of the usage of our electronic resources were pretty okay, we couldn't count the usage, the online usage from our application because they don't use it. And this is slightly rude, but it was also part of my first days at the library. So we have this hall. The library, okay, there's this cubicle, the room where we have access for the public, and then we have the very long, large stacks. So lots of space for books, and only 200 seats for the public. And the library is strategically located between a street facing the Grande Mosquée de Paris, which is a rather interesting street, quite passing in the 5th arrondissement, and the garden. So you can come to the library from the garden or from the street. And there is this strategic place, which is like a street, internal street with the hall. In the middle of the hall is a security guard that's imposed to us by the security manager of the Jardin des Plantes. And there, you know the way it works, there's a huge turnover of people, so there is no way to explain to the security officer the way the library works or how to direct people to our services. So the first contact for anybody coming here is the security guard and this sort of hallway, which is crucial, but that is absolutely not explicit about where you are. So most people who are there have no idea they are in a library. So I asked my team to do some research, and you know, you have all heard of what we call UX, user experience. So instead of thinking, just observe what's going on. So we spent 3 months in the hall. You know, the team was formed, and we were just counting what people were doing, where they were going from dot A to dot B, and the conclusion of that strategic and very scientific study is that the most used service was the restroom. Because we have a restroom which is quite clean, and that is referenced in this famous guide, Où faire pipi à Paris, which is a very good book. When you live in Paris and you need to go to the restroom and you don't want to pay, this gives you all the secret addresses where you can, you know, pee for free. And I've discovered that being in a bookstore, that we were in there. And I know we're famous for that, at least. And so, yes, the most used service of the library is the restrooms. So then I started to think, this is kind of, you know, too bad, because first, as a civil servant, I realized how much we cost. You know, in that library, the network of our library, it's 80 people. It's staff of 80 people, so it's quite a lot of people, all civil servants. Our budget is 1.2 million euros, mostly used on acquisitions of books that nobody reads. And it's a significant budget and set of resources for a research library. If we compare those figures to the Natural History Museum library in London, we have at least 3 times as more staff. And we have more staff than in the Smithsonian as well. So I said, I think the public service should get more value for that resource that's invested in our equipment. And also, looking and talking to the staff, it's the question of the meaning on your work, you know, because you get to go every day to a place where there is very few researchers, and you're just there, and you're standing, and, you know, at the office desk, and you're waiting for people to ask you questions, but people don't ask any questions. They just sit and go to the restroom. So I thought it was very frustrating, because it's not like this library, my library, is in the desert. We're in the middle of an exceptional environment, you know, a garden, museums, people, streets, 5th arrondissement of Paris. And so it's very frustrating to have all these potential users there, but they're not coming. So that then came the explicitation of our identity crisis. So I like to draw. My cousin sitting here knows that. And I was not depressed because when you start a new job, you look at every problem as a challenge, so you're happy. So you just start dreaming. So I'm just sharing with you those little sketching what I drew one night when I came back from work. I said, okay, let's just have a vision of what could I do crazy with that library. So I planted trees, and you can see here things that you will see afterwards. We do have a cabinet of curiosities, a Wunderkammer, I think that says in German, from the 18th century in the middle of the library, totally hidden. And I really thought we should think about that concept of curiosity in the 21st century, but rethink what curiosity is today after the digital age. And I went further, and I imagined that in that wonderful new space, we would put together, conferences like here, but with a large sofa, and have a crazy conversation between, for instance, an anthropologist and a bear. We have living animals on site, we should use them. Well, introduce plants, think of something where the library would be, I'll get back to that, somewhere between a zoo and a garden, because there are so many similarities actually between growing plants and growing books, and maintaining animals and maintaining books. And we had the exceptional chance to have those universes to talk to each other. More seriously, the observations we made of researchers after observing the fact that the restroom was very much used, I spent time. I went to see the researchers. We have about 600 researchers that are based at the museum. And of course, we have many more researchers who come from other places of the country, who are involved from international programs and projects. And what's interesting, I don't know if I've already made that observation as a librarian, is we have a tendency to classify everything. Of course, we classify books, we classify knowledge, but we also classify people when we are good at thinking of marketing. So a researcher, you'd think you have to put him in the box of a researcher. So a researcher has very specific needs, and it has to be research material, research data, research services. But a researcher is actually also a human person who is actually functioning like other normal people. So, I'm looking at my cousin, because he's a researcher. So they have emotions. And through what happened with the digital, and I'll get back to that right after, they have been so much digitized in their activity that as normal human beings, they're starting to miss something. Like we all do, I suppose. Need to touch things in reality, need to talk to real people and not only on FaceTime or in video conferences, need to meet them in real life. And also, the internet has led us to be much more interactive with things, with knowledge, than passive, as maybe we have a representation it used to be. So things that virtual experience has taken away from us might be necessary to bring back in the landscape of the library. But it's not about going backwards. So here I make a quick pause because there is this exhibition I was lucky to attend last year. So Sismo is a small company of design. They do design of services. It's really interesting. They come from industrial design, making objects. And then they got on board people who come from the digital, and also some anthropologists, people who are more interested in how to build services and observe end users. And together they have set up that team that's basically helping people to find solutions to a global problem that can involve both the arrangement of space and the arrangement of digital services, but think of that as a whole proposal and not with distinct approaches. So I asked them to help me to design a project that I'll show you later on, to redesign my library with that global approach. And so they invited me to a VIP event they were doing for Twitter. Twitter in Paris, that is located in a secret location. So we received invitations with a secret address, and everything was secret. And we got into that exhibition, and they wanted to show something revolutionary, which has a lot to do with what we're talking about today. So what Sismo did for Twitter that year, imagine a space close to a famous building in Paris, in a very fancy area, with absolutely no digital technology, no computer, nothing. There was not even any Wi-Fi, it was deliberate. And they have organized things that happen on Twitter as a physical exhibition. So for instance, this is related to a particular event that was actually quite dramatic. I won't get into the details, but it was something, you know, a riot someplace in a country where things were completely difficult with the government and the population and the terrorists, and lots of people got killed. And I won't get into the details, but that's the sort of event. So on the wall, you know, printed on paper, there were the different tweets that could help you understand the chronology of the event and who had said what at what time. And then the links between the tweets were materialized with those red strings. So you imagine a room, a large room with this net of all the red strings everywhere, and all of a sudden you see a tweet. You see a series of tweets, but you actually sit in the space. And I thought, wow, that's really interesting, the way it materialized the tweet experience on objects. And you react it in a very different way than when you just see it on your screen. Other example, you may know of this French singer called Julien Doré, who's a slightly provocative singer with a rather young audience. So he has a famous tweet string for his fans. So he's known for having very sharp answers and kind of funny answers to whatever his fans write. Like a fan would write, I love you so much, and he will answer, I don't know, or what's your age, or things like that. But better jokes than that. So there they put those questions and answers, like the conversation between the singer and his fans, in something that looks like a Rubik's Cube, you know? And you can just play with it and laugh at it, and just touch the tweets. And this is funny, and this is special because you are librarians. So they also looked at tweets that were mentioning books, like people loving books, and they're trying to find a very smart way of organizing those tweets where people were recommending books, and they came up with what sounds to me like a library or, well, a bookshop. And so they were trying to rematerialize the digital experience in space in a place with no technology. So when I saw that, I thought, if even the GAFAs, like the great internet company, are thinking of reselling themselves or thinking of themselves in a material way, maybe that's not just me who's aging. Maybe there's something more global happening. So just to recap, I think that what we have to do, and that's where you can bring back an idea that is something you will translate in your own environment, is just think what the digital did to us and what does it do to you, and how can you reinvent your activity, maybe just in a very easy way. It doesn't have to be sophisticated. But what we do, we are in an economy of recommendation. So we like, you know, on Facebook, we used to like, or people don't really dislike, they like. That's interesting. They share, they post, they do events. So we have to organize services, and this is a very commonplace because many libraries are already doing that, but it's just a way to rephrase it in a way where people have acquired some, you know, habits in the social networks and on the web in general, in the application world, and they expect that they might have the possibility to do the same sort of things in the physical space. While we librarians, our history is that we may have a more conservative and vertical notion where people have questions, we answer their questions, and we provide a service. Well, we have to be much more iterative in what's going on in the co-building of knowledge, as people say. And also, it's about starting from the end user, not coming to us, ask a question in the format we expect, but just expressing a usage, so giving him the space or her the space to be what they are and start from there. So I don't know how digital that is, but that's something the digital has made quite obvious in the way people were behaving and what they would expect from a service. So I came to the point where I realized people had lost, or really what they needed is something emotional. We need emotions. We need to be able to dream. And that's something we've always seen in libraries. We always knew if you have heritage collections that people see a nice object or an old object, an archive that tells the history of someone, you know, an archive where a manuscript, you know, this is This was the handwriting of Stendhal, and I'm holding that particular piece of manuscript in my hand, and that's, that's touching. And we always thought of that like an extra layer of meaning, or an extra something. Why don't we make it the core of our mission, of our activity, and assume that, okay, we're going to sell dream. Make people dream, make people feel, is actually a public service we could decide that the library is providing. So that's what I decided to do. So it's not about doing anything. My 200 seats could be easily filled with students from the neighborhood. In the 5th arrondissement of Paris, there are many universities, and like here, I suppose, the students are struggling for room, space, because the real estate in Paris is such that students don't have a proper place to work at home. So the library is essential as a living space for them to go work and live. And they live in libraries. So I could have easily marketed my library saying, okay, opening hours or such, go on the web, say, well, any students welcome. And my library would be packed in no time. And I could show the figures to my management and say, see, we've succeeded. No, I think that would be too easy because we have to keep in mind the mission or the purpose of your library. So what I'm trying to do, which is kind of, not easy, is to market my library and market the services to people, I would say that not necessarily are students or researchers in natural history, but for whom sitting at the museum makes sense. It's not only because there's a nice view or the restroom, but also because some reason, because they started planting flowers on their balcony, because they decided to have a particular take on urban environment, and we have all these citizen movements in Paris, like you have here, around nature. Well, that the library should be open to such public and provide whatever they want. So it has a connection in terms of meaning and mission to what we are. But it's broader than just show me that you have a PhD in natural sciences and I'll open you the door of the library. In a nutshell, and that's also something I think interesting, my library, but you could translate that analysis to your own environment, was designed for and by natural scientists, but actually maybe this core initial audience is not so much in need of us, but we realize that what we have is actually very interesting for other audiences. I'll just tell you a few words about the way it works in natural sciences for creating a taxon, so deciding that a species exists and name it and make it official according to what we call the Code de nomenclature internationale en sciences naturelles, en histoire naturelle. And that's very interesting to a librarian. For a taxon, so the name of an animal or any natural species to be officially acknowledged and recognized as such by the international community, it requires two conditions. First, there must be an article that is published, and the article will associate the name of the author and the name of the species, and usually they are combined. The scientific name of a species is usually a combination of the name of the person who discovered and did the determination of that species and the name of the closest species put together in Latin, which is still a language very much in use in my community, which is funny. So we need an article, but the second thing is that the animal or the flower needs to be figured. There must be a drawing of this thing. And the outcome of that is for all those years of collecting taxons and making them official, we became an amazing library of pictures. We have so many pictures, drawings, and before photography and even after photography, we have so many images of all the world's natural forms. And now look at what's happening with furniture design or clothing. We realized that our collections were extremely attractive to designers. So we started to reach out to fashion designers, architect designers, furniture designers. And we realized that we could be a place of inspiration for people who have nothing to do with natural history, but are just actively creating things for the world. And that brought out new public. So the conclusion of that is that you might need to keep in mind your initial mission, but think that what you have in terms of resources may be completely revisited because the world has changed and there are other opportunities for other audiences to reach out. So let's get physical. I'm going to tell you short stories of things we've done concretely to change that or to achieve that. So I will start saying that the first thing we did, it's like when you're changing house. You know, you decide to have new tech in your life, you're moving away, or you actually don't have the resources to move out. So what do? You clean your place. You clean your place. To think in a new way, you have to empty whatever has been left. And there's all these areas of a library, just like in your apartment, where you've put things that you will see later what to do with them. So you take all the later and you do it now. So we started during 6 months, all the team, just to get rid of all the crap that we didn't want anymore to have on our way, because you cannot think in a new fashion with all those leftovers from the former lives of your predecessors of all sorts. And you must take the decisions that nobody wanted to take. So throw away, take away, clean the space. And that feels so good. And many things that the staff had never dared doing because they were never given permission to do it. So to build a new library, we had to just make it empty. So I just showed us pictures, a bit like Ghostbusters, this guy, even myself with the dusters. So we took the dust away so that we could invent new things in that space. Second thing, which is a bit of a symbolic thing, you need to use symbols. So this is the rare books department of the library, of my library, which used to be totally closed to the public. When I came in, only 4 people had permission to get in, myself and 3 curators, and that's it. We've done a lot of work to improve the security of that room. We now have a camera, surveillance, and various additional, renewed standards of security and access codes. And from the moment the security had been reinforced, we started opening that room to the public. Not every day, but as part of many adventures or tours I will tell you more about after. And from that moment, opening that precious stacks, we could share the most beautiful piece we have, and that cannot really be moved out of that room. So instead of getting the pieces out, we get the staff in, the users in. So for that, we needed a symbol. And this particular table here that you can see here, and you can see details there, was stored somewhere in the mineralogy gallery of the museum in rather poor condition. It was invisible to the public. That table was designed in Florence. It belonged to Mazarin, it belonged to King Louis XIV, and then to the next king, who ultimately gave it to the museum with the mission to have it shared and seen by the public, which was not exactly the case. And the feet these are dolphins. It's really beautiful. It's made of marble. It's la marqueterie de marbre. It has an exceptional value, both scientific and aesthetic, and of course financial. So I thought it would be an interesting symbol just to set a table, just like at home again, a table around which you would have people together, maybe not to eat, not right there, but get in the sense of sharing something around a table. So I remember that day, it cost us 10,000 euros to get just the table moved from one building to the other, with a special team from a special company to get the table in and back to the visibility of all. And then it was just a start. Like the staff understood that they had lots of stuff hidden in the stacks that we could show your stuff. So here you have the team who's actually rediscovering paintings we had in the basement that we started to set in the reading rooms. And now they are changing on a regular basis. Of course, we're careful about conservation issues, so you won't put something that's fragile too much in the light or not too long in the light, but all of a sudden the animals and the trees were coming to the public space again. And then there's the story that I like best, is the gardeners. So, we have, I came with that statement that the library was insulated, but just in front of the garden. And we have, 80 librarians and we have 80 gardeners. Okay, don't misunderstand me, but I just observed that most of my colleague librarians were women and most of the colleague gardeners were men. I thought maybe we could match them in somehow, find a way, to get together. Not necessarily through a dating thing, but it's too bad we're so close. And I always liked gardening, and especially in the botanical garden. And I thought, we're both planting things of some sort. You know, the librarian is planting books and trying to use those seeds to put in people's bread, so to create knowledge, and you know, the gardeners do the same with the plants, and we're next door. So I thought, how could I get the gardeners to come in the library, you know, to do things with us? And I thought, well, we have something very precious, which is the archive of the institution. So I talked to the master gardener, I explained my project. I said, wouldn't it be interesting to show your staff what their predecessors in many, many generations have done, and the sort of archives they've left? So we organized that. For instance, those are the diaries of the greenhouses. So day after day, like on a boat, it tells the temperature, it tells what happened, it tells stories, decisions that were taken. Some of the really moving things we discovered going through those archives were, for instance, what happened during the war. And the gardeners discovered that what their ancestors had done in the various wars, like when decision was taken by the master gardener that instead of, you know, beautiful flowers during the war, we could grow food, vegetable in the garden, so that the staff and the people from the neighborhood could be fed from the garden. So there were those moments that most of us had completely forgotten or never heard of, where the garden was actually used in time of war, you know, like a vegetable garden. And other stories of that sort that were a bit heroic, where they felt extremely proud. And the result of that is that they told us, oh, well, we should give you, we don't have archives anymore because we're all digital. We don't use the library. When we need to know what a flower is, we go on the application and we go on Wikipedia. But actually, we could come to you because we have stories to tell. And many of the gardeners, especially the master gardeners, are old. And we realized they were all going to retire soon. Well, most of them have been in charge for over 40 years. So that gave us many ideas to start an oral history of the gardeners, because gardeners don't write or don't write much. So we set up a little studio and we're going to record their history. They will come to tell their story as gardeners and their memories as gardeners, and that will go in the collection in digital form as oral archive. But as such, it will really work, I think. So I was not hoping as much as what I got, but what did they do? They planted a garden for us. So we have this terrace just at that space between the garden and the library, and the terrace is, you know, now it's much nicer, it's completely blooming. I just took pictures of when they came in to install the garden. And they said, okay, we really want to make the junction between the library and the garden, and the librarians, the gardeners, so we're going to plant you a garden on the terrace. The only thing, you know, it's a lot of work to water the plants, and that's extra work for us. I don't no problem, the librarians will take care of it. So we had a meeting with my staff. I said, okay, do you agree that we form a group, and even though it's not in, you know, official position paper or job description, you'll spend like maybe once a week, that team will agree to water the plants. And they said, that would be so cool. We'd love to, because that's a change. And we know the librarians who work there, they like plants. So that's the business model we formed with the gardeners, that we take care of the daily maintenance of the plants, and they come twice a year to change the plants or, you know, make big decisions on the flowers we have. And, you know, those are very small, short stories. This is not much, but the combination of those things end up making sense. So more overall, we started to, when I say open the stacks and tell stories, the important part here is maybe more stories. And I get more to the continuing education / management part of my story. So I told you, and I was take the opportunity to sit again. So to us, to do the public duty, like in most libraries, to be at the bibliographical desk and wait for someone to come and ask a question. And I said, okay, we're going to organize things, so special events. We do about 10 of them a year, where there will be a call for projects among the staff, regardless of their category, whether they're curators or from other categories of the team. And whoever has, you know, really wants to talk about a particular part of the collection, like a famous donator or famous collection, famous set of drawings, and wants to build up a story and tell that story to the public is welcome to propose a paper. First, we didn't have many, but then the first ones came in, and then we had more. And we have these sessions of about 1 hour that are really not uncommon in research libraries and heritage libraries, but that are designed and marketed as backstage stories from the librarians. And what I realized is that when you have a story told by someone who's doing the actual job, even though this person was not trained as a mediator, the public loves it even more, because they really get the feeling, they get into the materiality of a secret job and the backstage of the institution. And when we interview the public after those sessions, what they say is, you know, what I preferred, of course, the collection was nice, but what was so nice is to see people who are so passionate about their job. And then I realized that our main resource might not be the exceptional heritage collection, but the fact that there was all this hidden knowledge from the librarians that we've always been sort of ashamed of or thought it was irrelevant, ultimately exposed to the public as something of value. Also because in this digital world, showing people who do things with their hands, who actually touch the original, is bringing a lot of emotions. So we do a lot of those things now. And for the staff, it's been amazing, because many people got really proud of what they were doing, and also the team building around that is really bringing a lot of strings between the staff that did not exist before. And what we try to do also is to, for any project like that, we arrange a couple, or we ask the staff to work as a couple, usually someone with more experience, usually older, and more of a younger colleague, and they will combine their expertise or their qualities to form a team. And for me, that's very important also for the transmission of knowledge. 10, 15, okay. Because one thing I forgot to mention is that out of the 80 people who work in my library, in the past 3 years, 50% left. And they didn't leave because of me, at least not all of them, but because many of them retired, because that's sort of the demographic moment. So on the one hand, it's been extremely interesting because I had the possibility to recruit actually almost 40 people, which is huge. So you can recruit people on the basis of new profiles or new energy, but at the same time, we lost a lot of knowledge. We lost the knowledge of the collection. So we have to organize with the 40 that are left from the older generation, the transmission of the knowledge of the collection to the younger or to the newer. And that particular way of mediation with the public has been extremely instrumental in creating that. I'm saying that also because some of you are really into continuing education, so I think it's an interesting way to look at the way you build a shared culture around the collection without necessarily having a super organized training program, but just make things that will help people to work together for the public. This is something extremely recent because that was 2 weeks ago for Les Journées du Patrimoine. Probably you have something similar in Switzerland, Heritage Days. That's one of the last weekends of September. We opened the library Saturday and Sunday. Normally we're not open on Sunday. And we got about 600 people. Each of them came for at least 1 hour of those adventures in the library. And I just focused on that particular thing we did, which is a workshop, where we try to combine everything I've been telling you about. So there is this word, gyotaku. Gyotaku is a Japanese word. It's a Japanese technique in the Japanese art to paint with fish. So the Japanese masters would use a real fish and use it on nice paper, and adding colors to the fish, so painting the fish, and then the print of the fish would come on the paper, and that would be the technique to form some particular very beautiful iconography. And this is a very old technique. So we had some of those works that came from Japan in our collection at some stage, because we got things from all over the world, and we thought, okay, how do we combine that with the fact that we want to also have an event around fish, because this year we have this big exhibition in the museum about oceans, so we wanted to have things that were, integrating in the overall program. And also, we made a discovery. We were going through a manuscript from Charles Plumier, who was a scientist and a religious man. Usually they were all of that together, who explored Latin America in the 17th century. And we were, our team of conservation was going through cleaning that manuscript. And really, they found something on and they analyzed the thing on the paper, on the manuscript, and they realized that was actually something that came from a fish, from a living fish. So we realized that that particular scientist and religious man had been using the same technique as the Japanese. It was like a revolution. So we thought, okay, we'll take that story, make a story to the public, and then have them build their own gyotaku. So those were modeled from fish specimens that are kept in the collections of the museum and made by the staff from the collections of the museum. Then we had the people who are the fish expert of the museum who were present for 2 days explaining to the public and showing them the drawings and also explaining how we take care of fish in the collection. And then people had the possibility to make their own gyotaku and bring it back home. And that works super well, either for the kids or the older public. This is more classical, but this is to tell you I managed to have my dream of having an anthropologist and a bear having a conference. The bear is here. His name is Nelson. He joined the team last year. He's been dead for many years, but well, now we have a bear in the library. That story is also very simple. I think many librarians are used to have a writer in residence. You're probably familiar with that sort of program. So we had Bérangère Cournu, who's a young writer. She's here. That's Bérangère. Was given a grant for spending a year in the library. Her project was to write a fiction novel about the people from Greenland, the Inuit population. She had written a previous book about the Hopi, which is a population in Arizona and New Mexico. And she found, well, we had prepared for her the archives of Paul-Émile Victor, who was a famous explorer of the Nordic pole. And she went through all those archives, and she never went to Greenland. Never. So she invented from the archives what could be the setting of her fiction, and she wrote that book that tells the story of a woman in Greenland, in sort of a historical Greenland based strictly on the sources of the archive. And her book was published. It recently received the Prix FNAC, and it's just been published now. It's getting a lot of success. So we organized a debate between her and another woman, Joëlle Robert-Lamblin, who's an actual anthropologist who lived among the Inuits in the 60s and the 70s. She really was there in Greenland for a long time and had a very hard life there, and she observed as an anthropologist. And we confronted those two women's experience of one writing a book about an imaginary Greenland, and the other sort of telling the story of what it was to live there really. And that was at the time, we have all these very political discussions right now about if you can write about anything. Do you need to be someone from somewhere to write about this place? The issue of to colonize the imagination of a people. That's a big, big topic. And we were right there in this discussion. And it was extremely interesting to have, fiction and science, art and science in conversation under the look of the bear. And further than that, the meeting of those two generations of women was super, super moving. I don't know if I do that. I do that, okay. This is just for me to take a little break. We had this dancer. So there was the terrorist attack in Paris. You've all heard of that. And Nadia Vadori-Gauthier is a contemporary dancer. And after the terrorist attack, like many people, she asked herself, what could I do to, what could I do? And all she can do is to dance. So she started that project that every day she would go in a place in Paris and dance for 1 minute. And then she would post her dance on the internet. Altogether, she danced more than 2,000 times. So you can go on the website and see all the places where she's been dancing. So that's the central stacks of the library. So that day we were happy. We had been careful about taking the dust away. So we could welcome those ladies to dance. And so she wanted to dance in a library because it's a place of knowledge. And she wanted to dance in the library of the Natural History Museum because it's also a garden, so it's a symbol of things that are, can be, even though when things are dead, they can be renewed, they can live again. And they did that, and it just lasts 1 minute. It's kind of weird, it's contemporary dance. But that was so cool. And the people who work in the stacks, which are not the most qualified librarians, they just loved it that we would come in their space, do something like that. And it took 2 hours one morning. So, and we showed that to many people, researchers in the museum. And I said, we had no idea that you could be of interest to people like that. I said, library is cool. I mean, look, they never went to a lab. They came to the library. So it was also good marketing. So I'll go fast just with examples. This is my deputy, Julien, and I told you in the beginning that the library building from the 60s is very ugly, or everybody said it was ugly. And Julien, in a parallel life, is a student in art history, really interested in library architecture. So he decided to write this thesis about the library and using the archives of the library, of the building of the library. And we realized that that building had been transformed, like they always do over time. In a way that was really betraying the initial architecture, which was actually super functional and super beautiful. So he made a session both for the staff and for the public. Using, you can see here, we found objects that used to be the librarians' daily object, like a lamp or the typewriter. There is showing pictures of the library, even the catalogs of the stuff that were ordered when the building was built. We discovered those chairs where from 1963, we had like hundreds of them in the stacks, and we thought they were just made of plastic. We discovered they were super designed, super functional, and they were the top quality of chairs back then, and we decided to take care of them. So we had this work on our house itself, like the library as a building, to rehabilitate this vision we had of it. Okay, then we had more. We got the birds in the library. This time they were dead birds again, sorry. Now, this guy is an expert on birds. He works at the museum. And the woman together is one of my curators who's experts on bird collections in the manuscript. And it's just as simple to have them make presentations together with birds surrounding the audience. Maybe you've heard of Theodore Monod, who was a great guy who died at age 100. Was both a fighter for the human rights, a famous taxonomist, and also an anthropologist. He worked a lot in the desert. So we have all his archives, and so we decided to have a very hands-on sort of exploration of his work. So the colleagues here, what they've done is really it's very simple. It's a map showing everywhere he's been, starting from the geography of that, and then taking the public in all the material, like stories he wrote as a child, diaries from his various trips, lots of photographies and storytelling about Theodore, based on a circulation or trip on the map of Africa. Well, like many, we had our first escape game. The only interesting part of having an escape game, because that can be seen really as a gadget, is that this escape game, which was called À la recherche de l'explorateur disparu, was completely designed by the team themselves. They came up with the projects that we want to have our own escape game. And so it's a story about a professor who has disappeared. And through that, the story of the game is we need to find what the professor was working on, what his research was. It ends up the research was the dodo, the bird that disappeared. And it ends up, the game goes through all the backstage space of the library, all the forbidden spaces, so the public loved it. It was only a group of 6 people with at least 2 librarians always with them. And the funny part is that it ends up in the director's office, and I was playing my own role, except that was in 1834, and I was dressed accordingly. I'll skip that. So I'm coming to my conclusion. So I'll just have to say that I showed you the funky stuff, but there's a lot of very basic stuff we did that will sound more familiar to you probably. We extended the opening hours of the library. We restructured the organization, so all those activities were put as priorities, which was not so obvious. So for instance, we redeployed a lot of the resources from cataloging to that sort of mediation. We simplified lots of procedures. Everything was too complex. We had at least 5 ways to register an end user. Well, we had no more end users, so it was kind of silly. So made everything easy also for the staff to start asking themselves questions on how to deal with the procedures that you never use because you don't have enough activity. Staff training, I mentioned it, was really crucial. And it still is a major aspect. And staff training and management are completely related. To me, it's the same thing. You're like what we call education, and we talk discussion or even negotiation. To me, are part of the same form of global view of the way you manage your team. And I just mentioned that's for the researchers that I'm not talking about that today, but that's, if you ever want to talk to me about that part, that's my other really core subject right now, is the open access and the open data part, bringing the researchers to come to the library, not to look at the collections, but come for some sort of support when they're building a research project, support when it comes to methodology, standards, or any sort of data management, because we do have qualifications in this area. And from there, try to get the librarians embarked or involved in research projects to the point where we are the obvious natural partner when it comes to the open repository, the open science part of the institution of the museum. So that's not the topic of the day, but I just wanted to mention it as part of the things we've been doing as well as this other actions. So the result is we started from very low, so those are not spectacular figures, but I can say now when we go to the reading rooms, 2/3 of the reading rooms of the seats are occupied at any time of the day. The funny thing, I was really surprised, we have more consultation of the online catalog, which is really old and kind of useless, but people use it more. And I think, and that's something I already said, but I think that's really important. Storytelling might be a good thing when stories are told by people who know, but are not used to tell. That is, people who are not professional tellers, but they really have heart and passion in what they're doing. And I won't mention that, but maybe that's one area where you might have questions afterward. I had to do a whole work at the governing level of the museum to have this sort of vision installed and accepted by the authorities of the museum. So for me, it's a lot of work of conviction, of advocacy for doing or looking at things differently, and finding the right position of the library within the wider environment of the museum. Some of your colleagues in Geneva yesterday were asking me how much were you competing with the galleries or the rest of the museum. I said, we've always been very humble, showing that what we were doing was to support what the others were doing, never claiming to do it ourselves. If anybody wants to take the credit out of it, we don't care, it's the museum. And also, we try to be a laboratory. We say we're a lab for the rest of the museum. And that actually works. We're testing things. We're a small library compared to the rest of the huge institutions. So we're trying small things in small formats. We can actually have the resources to put quite a lot of stuff on preparing those events. And if it works well, maybe that can expand to a wider vision of what the museum could do in terms of mediation. So just to end up with the true reason why I'm in Switzerland is because I need money, like everybody. So no, we have this project to redesign the building. And that's the Cabinet of Curiosity I mentioned in the beginning of my talk. And together with that Sismo company I mentioned, we've been designing, before, after sort of thing. So the idea is to redesign the building around those lines, and only the the main, this particular space I told you, which is between the street here and the garden. And the idea, which is very, when you find many ideas that you find in many libraries, we all do more or less the same, is to have a place that could be at the same time a space for exhibitions or cabinets of curiosities. Here we have the historical cabinet, and the idea would be have to have a contemporary version of that, like a 21st century answer to that 18th century object. A space that would still be a reading space. Here we called it causerie, a space where people can sit for informal talks like we have today, or maybe less formal than today. For any scientist from the museum, like coming back from an expedition, want to tell the story, bring back stuff, show to the public. Those are little labs that would be maybe fab labs where we could have a very physical experience of manipulation of collections, but also data operations, like manipulation of data. And here in our building we have a particularity. Next door is the Great Gallery of Evolution, and the idea is to have a little anamorphosis, like some sort of optical window where people could understand where they are, and we could sort of have a visual experience, optical experience facing the Great Gallery of Evolution. I'm going fast so that we have time for questions. So that's what it could look like. And I particularly like this idea is that the library becomes really a street, you know, from the street to the garden. And in that street, there are possibilities to interact with the staff, not behind, you know, the desk, just asking for bibliographical information, but sharing around what we can do with our hands, and a way of having sort of a sample of the collections and an introduction to the collections. And that's the part where we imagine to have talks with the cabinet of curiosities behind. And that's it. Thank you very much.